How about an executive order mandating that all federal buildings have to look like the Acropolis? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. And this episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, as well as our buddies over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest. We will include a link to the Patriot Post in the description below. Gentlemen, there is architecturalrecord.com has come across a proposal for an executive order that's been floating around. It's unclear exactly how they got a hold of it or from whence it came. But basically, if the president were to sign this, it would say that every federal building, not just in Washington, D.C., but, federal court buildings in towns across the country, all of those would have to, if they cost more than $50 million to build, they would have to be built in sort of a classical architectural style, like the ancient Greek and ancient Roman buildings and the kind that are so popular in Washington, D.C. And the reason why people are pushing this idea is because they believe that those are symbolic of democracy in the case of ancient Greece, of a republic in the case of ancient Rome, and that this group of people who are advancing this notion believe that the brutalism and deconstructionism of modern architecture has been an utter failure and does not accurately convey the spirit and the values of the United States government. Stephen Green, you probably understand this better than I do, having suckled at the teat of architecture books when you were a very young child. How is it possible that such an issue like this could even be important? After all, they're just buildings, right? Who cares whether they're modern or classical?
Yeah, all cars should just be, the rectangular boxes. You don't need them to look a certain way to express your personality or anything like that. We should all just drive square boxes and be done with it. No. What a country builds says a lot about a country because the country built those things. I think it's very important. And if you're not familiar, for our audience members, if you're not familiar with the brutalist style, we're talking about these big square block buildings that look like authority. They have no grace. Like the example that was in the article about this that I saw showed the FBI headquarters.
That's the one.
Yeah, and God, it really suits J. Edgar Hoover. It's just it sits there and it looks angry and don't cross this building. It's hideous. It's not American. It has none of the grace, none of the elegance, none of the timeless beauty of Roman or Greek architecture. And I would really like to see us get back to that. And I don't mean people should be building their houses in this style or anything like that. I think that's a little silly. But for government buildings, absolutely. For more public buildings too. I remember having a conversation. This has got to be 20 some years ago now. I don't think I've been living in Colorado more than a year or two. So mid 90s, I guess. And I was at an art museum up in Denver. And on display was the model for the new Denver Art Museum, which is all this cantilevered stuff and all this new construction where you've got things, roof lines swaying out at crazy angles and curves and stuff. And I'm looking at the case. I think I was with my girlfriend at the time, and I said, this thing looks like it's about to fall down. And one of the other visitors at the museum is standing there sort of next to me and says, well, I think it looks kind of exciting. And I said, well, I think the art is exciting enough, the stuff inside. And the message of a museum, of a government building, should be to express an aspiration. The exciting stuff should be on the inside, at least in terms of an art museum. That said, what I want to know is, where did this bubble up? This executive order didn't occur in a vacuum. Who got the president's ear?
Well, I'm not sure they have the president's ear yet on this, Steve, but let me tell you where this is bubbling up from. There's a board that President Trump appointed somebody to in Washington that's related to this idea of federal architecture. And that person came from something called the National Civic Art Society. And apparently this unknown previously to me, Art Society has had a lot of impact and has been driving a narrative that says basically contemporary architecture is by and large a failure, and they want to return to these what they call pre-modernist roots. And so apparently they've been very influential, so much so that the American Institute of Architects has felt that they had to come out and make a statement strongly opposing any style mandates. And rather, they said that the style should be determined by local tastes and by local settings, and that there should be a diversity in federal buildings.
Well, I have no problem with certain modernist architecture. My only regret with being born in 1969 instead of 1869 is I was never able to have Frank Lloyd Wright design a house for me. That just would have made my entire life to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. But that said, I find it very heartening that there is an arts group that is willing to go back to the classics for public architecture. That makes me very happy.
Well, Bill Whittle, I find this whole area is really fascinating because in doing a little bit of research, a very small amount of research on this, and I do not pretend to understand anything about architecture, but I found that these guidelines for federal architecture were talking about something that was written in 1962 by then Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And his objective for these federal buildings was to provide, and I'm quoting here, visual testimony to the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of the American government. Now, these new guidelines that have been drafted in hopes of getting a presidential executive order, they adopt that same kind of language, but basically they go against the 1962 writing in a couple of ways, one of which is that in 62, Moynihan said we shouldn't have any kind of official style, that the style should reflect the times, and that the architectural profession should the style should flow from the profession of architecture to the government and not the other way around. Bill, does conservatism mean preserving a style of building that was popular in the late 1700s?
It was popular in 200 BC. It was popular in 400 BC. So I'm not too worried about when it was popular. It was already a couple thousand years old when they first built the White House and the Capitol building and the Supreme Court building and all the rest. One of the things that's shocking about Washington is just how beautiful the buildings are in Washington. Washington is just such a pit in terms of the politics, and urban Washington is also just a terrible place in terms of murder and so on. But when you actually get on the Mall and you see the Capitol building and the Lincoln Monument and the White House, it's just breathtakingly beautiful, breathtaking. The Kremlin has its own style, and the Kremlin is a fortress, and it's built like a fortress, and it's made out of this very strange colored red. It's architecturally consistent, if nothing else, but it looks like a fortress. Washington D.C. looks like they look like temples, and that's kind of what they are. They're supposed to be. They're temples to freedom. Try to imagine the Lincoln Monument in just like slabs of gray concrete. And inside there sits Lincoln with kind of that, that clay kind of thing where it's not like a real clay. It's like they just threw clay in the general representation of his face. It just wouldn't have the same effect. It would be almost like an art exhibit. But certainly at the Lincoln Memorial, you get the sense of this being a holy place. This is a temple. It is a temple to something, and people walking up those stairs, facing those columns, and seeing Lincoln sitting in his chair like that. Everybody just gets quiet, and that's not an accident. First of all, I'm against the idea of doing this by executive order. I'm against executive orders in general. I think they should pass legislation for this, but I'd be very much in favor of that legislation. The reason this is important, especially now, is that it would continue to, it would reverse the terrible trend of divorcing us from our own philosophical roots. We are a product of Judeo-Christian morality, Greco-Roman philosophy, and we built ourselves a capital that looks like a series of temples to rationality and to good governance. if the FBI building's easy to pile on because it looks like it's piling on to people. That's what the FBI building looks like. It looks like somebody dumped a bunch of concrete slabs down to keep people down underneath it. It looks Soviet. Stalinist architecture is not terribly different from brutalist architecture. Most Soviet architecture is brutalist. It's designed to intimidate you. It's designed to make you feel small, and that's why it's called brutalist architecture. Here's the power of the state, and you're just this little creature walking underneath these concrete overhangs and stuff, which could come down at any minute and squash you like your bug that you are. If you look at the Supreme Court building, on the other hand, you look at the Supreme Court building and you feel like justice lives in there, whether it does or doesn't. And I think for the most part, it does. Just walking up the stairs of those buildings prepares you for what they represent. They represent rationality. They represent reason. They represent appeals to republicanism in terms of the little r republicanism. The idea that this is a house of the people and it deserves to be celebrated. The last thing I'll say about this is every now and then I'll walk into a building. Like in the Capitol is a great example, but there are other private buildings all over the place. And you walk inside this building from the 30s or something, let's say Grand Central Station, let's just take that as an example. That's certainly not neoclassical or in any way. But you look at buildings made from any time really prior to the 60s, and you look at it and you said, this is the product of a society that has confidence in itself, that's proud of itself. The Art Deco statues at Hoover Dam are hardly, Greco-Roman classical, but they're vaulted and they're elegant. They're these statues of angels with these incredibly long tapered wings, and they look like they're proud to be there. And I think this is an excellent idea that I think should be accomplished by legislation rather than executive order. And I think we should be reconnected to our past. And I happen to think that architectural style I agree with the argument completely. You look at the Capitol building and it defines our vision of what government should be. It's white, it's clean, it's elegant, it's rational, it's structured, the order is built into it, the number of windows, the number of columns. It looks like it was designed. I mean, like it was designed, not for anything, just like somebody designed it. We want something that's going to represent the fact that this is not only the spindle of power, but it belongs to the people. It's something that you can walk into. It's on top of a hill. It's open. You don't have to, it's not a brick wall. It's not a gate in the Kremlin wall. It's not this imposing hunk of concrete like the FBI building that virtually dares you to enter it.
Yeah. Hey, Scott, can I throw something in? Bill just made me think of this. You walk into the Capitol building after ascending those stairs, and it's an ascent on purpose, but you get inside the rotunda under that giant dome, and it is all light and air. It's a joyous space. But because of the white marble and the design elements of it, it's very serene. It's not a vulgar joy. It's a quiet joy. That's what I think of when I think of this country, and it's what I want other people to think of too.
And that dome, by the way, that dome evokes the celestial sphere. It gives you the sense that you have walked into a universe of order and reason and structure and justice, and that this dome represents this idea that you are now in this universe that is the kind of universe we would all like to live in.
Yeah.
And the last time I was there, I remember being inspired by looking up at that dome, and there's something about it, and this may seem counterintuitive, but there's something about it when you're walking under that, and let's say a U.S. senator walks past you. He's just another little guy under the dome.
Yep.
There's nothing magnificent about him. He's just another guy, in a nicer suit than I have, but and I think that there is oddly enough, in that soaring vaulted ceiling, an almost egalitarian spirit as far as the dignity of the individual human goes, which I found to be stirring. Bill's right, and so Steve, and some of these more modernistic buildings, they look like baby's first Sim City. It's just like when you first start to cobble together little slabs and blocks and things like that. I would start out by saying that the guidelines that this little group is trying to draft into an executive order are really targeted not to deal with every building that the federal government ever builds, but those of substance, those that are worth more than $50 million. So my first real comment would be that I think that the federal government should build very few buildings worth $50 million. We could solve all of this debate basically by saying, let's just not build a whole lot more buildings that are $50 million buildings. Especially, and scattered all over the country and just spending huge amounts of money. What I'd like to see is fewer federal buildings, but more inspired. Fewer buildings in general that cost a lot of taxpayer money, but ones that are more evocative of the spirit of the country. And I think you run into this another kind of quandary, because architects want to make a name for themselves. Thus, Frank Lloyd Wright, who's got these spectacular cantilevered houses and things like that, with apparently a plumbing that incessantly leaks. But you've got an architect who wants to have a distinctive. He wants to be the Andy Warhol of his profession, where everybody looks at one of those and says, "That's that guy." But when you're doing a public work, when you're designing for the public, there's a sense in which you don't want it to be about the artist. So you have a committee. And what we all know about committees is there are no statues of committees. And nobody likes the product that comes out of a committee. So what you have to find somehow is the kind of, people like L'Enfant, who laid out the streets of Washington, D.C., who found a way to do this in a glorious and beautiful way without it being all about him. And so where do you find such public servants? Where do you find the kind of people who are willing to do something and say, you know what, the main thing about this is going to be 200 years from now, I don't care if anybody knows my name. I care that my country persists and survives and is better than it is today. And that is the kind of spirit that has to drive an architect. And whether you decide that that's going to be done in the same sort of architecture, that our sort of colonial forefathers did it in, or the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, or something that is more up to date with modern sensibilities, I don't think is as important as the spirit behind the artist who says, this is not about me. This is about an idea that's bigger than me. And Bill, I think, hit it right on the head. These are temples to an idea that are bigger than any man. And where does one find men such as this who are able to put their pencil to paper without signing their name all over it? For Stephen Green and Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at Right Angle for making this possible. And thanks for our friends at the Patriot Post for also contributing to this effort.